I hope that today is the most you're going to hear me talk throughout this course. That's how Chris Doire starts a class for the year. The ironic thing is that the way he interacts with the class makes us all fervently hope that his opening statement will not be true. Chris has a distinctive way about him that becomes evident within a short span of time. He's a good listener, so much so that when students, called on to argue their ideas, inevitably lock eyes with Chris, he is the one that they want to convince. There is inherent validation in his agreements and disagreements alike because it is trusted that he's respectfully absorbed whatever has been released into the classroom. Chris is smart, an indisputable intellectual. His thoughts are never fleeting or indecisive. His ideas are strong and have been a long time coming. His opinions are evolved and always feel as if they've been drawn up from a variety of areas of expertise. But Chris speaks these ideas softly, connecting them in light, messy handwriting on a whiteboard, his index and pointer finger held aloft, poised together, his book unopened but held to his side as an instrument of valor, as he uses the exact right words to make the exact right point. But I think there's a certain element that really makes Chris Doire himself, one that is, for some reason, difficult to articulate. It is this sense of funny, awkward, quixotic randomness that inevitably emerges, and thank goodness it does. Sometimes his presence in class can feel like he's doing stand-up. He makes a joke, and no matter whether it's a brilliant witticism or a cop-out pun, he summons laughs because it's just so funny to see him try. He giggles heartily and with vigor, and so does the class. It can be ridiculous. At some point during my home and exile class this year with Chris, the topic turned to a museum of smells, where a visitor simply goes around and smells things. After giving it a little thought, Chris said earnestly and half to himself, "I'm sure that would be a wonderful idea for any person." If you've never witnessed a classic Doire chuckle, I suggest you do so as soon as possible. I was lucky enough to take an independent study with Chris for my senior year, in which we studied short stories. Struck by how frequently he was able to connect an Edgar Allan Poe story to a Japanese sci-fi thriller, to an obscure death metal band, to an upcoming exhibition at IPC, and then back again to Poe, I couldn't help but say, "So, you seem to know a lot about pop culture." I'll never forget how he responded, straight face, eyes locked, "It's kind of my thing." But Chris Doire's thing is that he has a lot of things. He is passionate and charismatic and awkward and pensive and well-read and opinionated. His thing is his inherently respectable demeanor, and his thing is that skull belt he wears that is impossible not to notice. His thing is to be knowledgeable and easy to talk to and extremely, extremely wise. I am indebted to him for the wisdom he has imparted in me in so skillful a way that I could feel I found it within myself. Please join me in welcoming Chris Doire.
Thank you, Rosa. Honorable graduates, their friends and relatives, teachers, and other friends, colleagues, Wendy and Bo, I'm honored to have been asked to deliver this year's graduation address. Most of you soon-to-be graduates were in my classes at one point, and I'm flattered that you wanted to hear me speak one more time. These speeches often connect some aspect of your education to what is sometimes misleadingly called the real world, as if school and your experiences here weren't part of the real world. The question of the relationship between one's education and the life experience that encompasses or follows it is a question that many of you will have already thought about, at least from our first week together in English 11, poring over, yes, Ralph Waldo Emerson's precepts for living. But today I'm more reminded of Ralph Ellison, who puts the question of education, formal and otherwise, at the forefront of his masterpiece, Invisible Man. The question is crystallized early on in a passage where, looking back from many years later on his college experiences, that novel's nameless narrator remembers the statue on his old campus of the college's founder. This statue actually depicts an interaction between two men, the founder standing tall in the middle of performing what the narrator calls the breathtaking gesture of lifting a veil that flutters in hard, metallic folds above the face of a kneeling slave. It isn't too difficult to see in this unveiling a symbol of enlightenment, though the word enlightenment is itself already a metaphor for the thing it names, a coming to an understanding or to wisdom. Even in its definition of enlighten in this particular sense, coming fifth in a long entry, the OED defines the verb first as to supply with intellectual light, and only then more prosaically as to impart knowledge or wisdom to instruct. The implication inherent in the word enlightenment is that instruction is intrinsically a good, something as practical and beneficial as having a light in the darkness, something as empowering as being able to see. As if education could never be at all what Lauryn Hill calls a miseducation. Yet the narrator of Invisible Man remembers or imagines himself standing before this statue, puzzled, unable to decide whether the veil is really being lifted or lowered more firmly in place, whether he is witnessing a revelation or a more efficient blinding. He reads the statue against the grain of his own life experience and the questions that that experience occasions about the significance of his college education. In this imagining of the possibility that the statue really depicts the college founders lowering the veil, there is a critique of the education the narrator was granted, a critique that, however, never really comes further into focus. What can it be? My students will sometimes conclude that this critique has to do with an illusory promise, that the completion of one's formal education carries with it limitless or at least expansive possibility, a promise of possibility that Ellison's nameless narrator ultimately, and through hard lessons, becomes disillusioned about. Now, racism on both individual and institutional levels plays its essential and overwhelming part in keeping Ellison's character from realizing his full potential. I have nothing new to say about such assumptions and systematic injustices tonight, although I want to note that they continue to exist and exert their power and must be recognized. Other assumptions, however, often the product of lessons learned unwittingly about what is possible and what is to be valued, also shape the course of the Invisible Man's life and of other people's lives. One thing I learned unwittingly in my large public high school was to look down on those peers of mine who, while I was in honors this and AP that, were pursuing what was known as a vocational track, taking classes in wood and metal shop, auto repair, mechanical engineering, with an eye to pursuing a particular, frequently blue-collar career. The Voc building was across the parking lot, past the outdoor space allotted by the school for students to smoke in during free periods. Yeah, believe it. Though I couldn't have said so at the time, something about the exile of those classes from the main building and the different schedules that those kids had came to signify their own separateness from me in a really defining way. And if someone had suggested to me that I take metal shop, I would have thought the suggestion an absurd joke. I was destined for what I had assumed were better things. My assumption had, if not a basis, at least an echo in the structure of the vocational training system, which did make it difficult for students enrolled in that track to break out of it, to move on to a liberal arts school if they wished, and all the possibilities such an education may entail. It wasn't until years later that I really understood how I had unthinkingly dismissed the value of those kinds of work and the lives of the people who did it. Not until I met my future father-in-law, an economics PhD who made a living plumbing and woodworking. It was work he loved, and he did it well. He made a decent living. He was able to send his 2 daughters here. He got more satisfaction from that work and from his later forays into violin making than he did from the macroeconomic analysis he spent so many years learning how to do in graduate school. And now that I'm a homeowner and a car owner, I regret my own continued ignorance of some of the essentials of maintaining a home and a life, many of which I could have learned from my own parents had I thought as a teenager to show more interest. I wish especially that I knew anything useful at all about what happens under the hood of a car. I'm fortunate to have married someone who knows what to do when the basement floods, and who taught me to cook and bake. There's a section in Walden in which Henry David Thoreau discusses the promise of formal education. You may remember that Thoreau's book is about the 2 years he spent in the 1840s in a house he built himself by Walden Pond in Massachusetts. He built his own house and he eked out a living subsistence farming, and at the outset of his book he's careful to show that he made a tiny profit in those years, even accounting for the cost of the materials he used to build his house. Not that those materials cost him that much, about $28, or about $700 in today's money. Thoreau goes on to consider the rooming cost at his alma mater, Harvard College, which was $30 a year then, and he concludes that students would get a more comprehensive education for less money if they built their own residences. Thoreau puts his reasoning thus, and here I'd like to quote at length. The student who secures his coveted leisure and retirement by systematically shirking any labor necessary to man obtains but an ignoble and unprofitable leisure, defrauding himself of the experience which alone can make leisure fruitful. But, says one, you do not mean that the students should go to work with their hands instead of their heads. I do not mean that exactly, but I mean something which he might think a good deal like that. I mean that they should not play life or study it merely while the community supports them at this expensive game, but earnestly live it from beginning to end. Which would have advanced the most at the end of a month? The boy who had made his own jackknife from the ore which he had dug and smelted, reading as much as would be necessary for this, or the boy who had attended the lectures on metallurgy at the Institute in the meanwhile, and had received a Rogers penknife from his father. Not that Thoreau was against formal education, he asks only that education be useful. Thoreau's practice of simplicity and the integrity of his way of life are examples that resonate with the values of a Quaker school community, particularly one with a commitment to experiential education. The disconnection between formal education and living might not be wholly a thing of the past, however. Today, Thoreau's alma mater offers 48 different areas of concentration, from African and African American studies to visual and environmental studies. Students go there with a wide variety of interests. Yet before the economic crisis, as many as 40% of a single Harvard graduating class flocked to jobs in consulting or financial services only. And only half of them would have made the same career choice if money were not an issue. But half wouldn't. Of course, the money's good. I myself was akin to that latter half as I studied postmodern literature and literary theory in college and graduate school, and then promptly found myself a job at a big hedge fund. I stayed in finance for nearly a decade, much to the surprise of many people who knew me, especially to the surprise of the people who knew me better than I knew myself, and who, when I at last resigned from my job to go into teaching, wondered only what took me so long. I know a lot of people who, on the recommendation of their degrees, very easily found jobs on career paths that, however, didn't bring them the happiness or deep satisfaction they were looking for. I do also know some consultants and financiers who wouldn't be happier doing any other work. My concern here is the way in which people often find themselves freely choosing to do things, whatever the field, that they might have known they wouldn't ultimately find to be fulfilling. Thoreau's two knife owners seem to have this in common, that they know what they want, even if they have different approaches to getting it. But elsewhere in Walden, Thoreau shows how deeply he understands that this kind of self-knowledge can be hard to come by. Bill McKibben, thinking about our contemporary way of life, says that Thoreau posed the two intensely practical questions that must come to dominate this age. How much is enough, and how do I know what I want? The latter question is echoed by Ellison's Invisible Man, alone in the big city after his college years are over, when he enjoys, intensely, and in a way that would have been anathema to his social aspirations, a baked yam with melted butter. I hope we'll be eating soon. He realizes that he doesn't even know himself well enough to tell in some cases whether he really likes or dislikes something, or has just been tricked into thinking he does. He wonders about all that he's lost because he unthinkingly follows the paths prescribed for him by others. It's no wonder that this novel resonates with so many teenagers who find themselves in the middle of their own journeys of self-discovery, acutely feeling the anxieties that come with it. One freshman expressed that anxiety recently with a portrait of herself as Sleeping Beauty, who, as the student pointed out, sleeps her way through the story that is supposed to be about her. Graduates, to be, soon. I trust that your friend's education has given you in plenitude the skills and knowledge that you will need to succeed in this world. I have witnessed the fruits of that gift in the 4 years you've been upper schoolers, writing papers, creating short films, songs, poems, and plays, performing the works of Shakespeare, Miller, Porter, and Mingus, among others, with passion, commitment, and excellence, painting and sculpting, building robots and competing in sports championships, conducting scientific studies and experiments, demonstrating social and political engagement. You're off to terrific schools and will be able to achieve great things. In the process, you will at times be faced with the questions, how much is enough, and how do I know what I want? Part of the value of your friend's education lies in the way it will have given you the mindfulness to ask and the tools with which to answer those questions for yourselves. Only by answering them will you not sleepwalk through your own lives, but earnestly live them to the end. Thank you.